Hi, how's it going?
Hey, I'm glad we sunk our wall colors in together. I mean, that is brilliant.
Oh, that is. Look at that. Fantastic. You're at the office in your office or where
Yes,
are you?
I'm in my office. So what do you
Yeah.
want to talk about today? What are you all excited about?
Hmm. Well, I was just down in Miami with my brother's brand new baby. And so I'm like fired up lately, I feel like about the maternal like birth and stuff, but I don't know if that's what we should talk about. But it was interesting this morning. I went into the high school, and this woman, she's a teacher. She routinely asked me to come back, but now I'm starting to wonder if I'm going to go back anymore. So she teaches like their health sciences class. So I've probably presented in her class at least 6 or 7 times at least. And so she asked me back. And the last time one of our like babysitters was in the class. And so she like sent me a message afterwards or a voice memo. And it was like she was pissed off because she was like, I feel like she just set you up to have this conversation. And then after you leave, she like, goes on her like rampage about like, I don't know if we were talking about vaccines or what we were talking about, right? But she's like, you didn't say that. And, so I took it as like, okay, this is the high school girl. Like, I thought we were having a fine dialogue. I didn't think anything of it really, but I was just like interesting that that's like she was all mad because obviously she would have like some sort of allegiance with me because she babysits my kids. Well, anyways, today I go in and Jack's actually with me because I didn't have daycare this morning, and so he sat in the back. But this woman, so I come in like again just talking about chiropractic and mind body and whatever, and like right away she wants to talk about vaccines. So I'm like, all right, well, if you like tee me up with this question, like I can't, like I'm going to tell you like my point of view on it and like how I got to my point of view. So we talk about it. She doesn't seem too hot and bothered about it. And one of the kids, they've got like a list of questions, right? And so one of the questions they asked is like, well, what's like essentially what's innovative in chiropractic right now, right? Like what's innovative in chiropractic? And I said, I don't know if I think chiropractic is innovative. I think we're more like stripping away some of the things that have always been there. We want to help our people connect to them. And then I said, I'll give you an example. Let's talk about birth and let's talk about some of the choices that we have in this country, right? Like most of the time things are moving too fast that many times a woman hasn't had someone really talk about some of the things that would probably fall under informed consent, but we're not talked about like when we're induced and they strip the membranes or they like give pitocin and there's these interventions that now move things along quicker, what that leads to for like health outcomes when it comes to like the breastfeeding and the relationships with the mom and the baby afterwards. And because the cascade of hormones has changed, therefore the timing of the milk coming in and all these things are many times altered. And you could just tell like she freaking hated everything I was saying. And I felt like I chose like I was like, and she's like, well, don't you want the best outcomes for mom and baby? And I was like, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, I just was like, and she's like huffing in the back of the like classroom. And then I was like, I am not getting paid. Why am I here? Like, and I'm here because the kids are sitting here. But like, I was just like, my blood pressure was like rising because I feel like I forget that there are like so many people that don't want to know, right? Like, they don't even want to have a conversation about some of this stuff. It doesn't mean that I'm right or she's right. It's like I just think like this is just a conversation we're having. Like, this doesn't mean that you made the wrong choice or I made the right choice. This is like, can we not just have it? But it was like, oh, you could just feel it. It was like erupting from her. And then I was like, well, I don't want to stand here and like, I'm in your classroom, but I also like, I can only speak my own truth. So it was just an awkward morning. And I haven't had one of those in a while where I'm like, am I like saying something that's really offensive right now? I don't think I'm saying anything that's really offensive. I'm just asking you to critically think. And I don't know, it's just weird sometimes when you get outside of these like bubbles and you have these conversations where I'm like checking, like, am I alive? Like, what's happening? It just feels like such an awkward, but yet I don't think it's an awkward conversation. It just seems like common sense. Um, I don't know.
Well, what's common sense for some is illogical for others, right? So
True.
I don't know if there's a better way to start a discussion with you. So I would just take this and have a discussion because this is a real issue that patients face every day. This is a real live scenario of emotional
Mhm.
quotient. So the emotional quotient, just a recap, peeps, of what that looks like is your ability to have a high intellectual emotional range, so to speak. So it's an intellectual quotient is now transferred into emotional quotient. And Lona, as you can see her smiling in this video as she's sharing the story, and I'm genuinely listening and I can feel the thickness because I've experienced something very similar in the room, just like that, where we're set up for a story and then it gives the post discussion a ton of fodder to shoot holes in that we're not around to experience, number one. And two, it can be used against us because we are different. So you kind of get pulled in. I mean, this is just one way. It doesn't mean that's what happened. I'm just saying it's fascinating that you got asked this question to give an answer and then have such an emotional response to that answer without seeing both sides of it. Like, your level of integrity, just knowing you, of course, I understand where you come from and your genuine sincerity about helping people and giving people choice, options, and also carrying high vibrations into relationships and spreading that type of karma into the world.
Mhm.
I know that about you. Maybe I think many people who know you do know that about you as well, even if they just meet you. Um, so in fairness, I do think that relationship is a little quirky because someone was feeding off of your insight in one area to then pick apart maybe another. And again, maybe I'm wrong, but
Mhm.
there's some aspect to that, it seems.
Well, and I understand too that there are there isn't a gray scale. I mean, there isn't a black and white here. It is a gray scale, meaning like what works for one person may not be the best choice for someone else. But I think like because Wade, I know you feel this way too. We generally do not speak in a way where we're making things that are like very like cut and dried answers because we've learned how to tiptoe around issues and still say things to help people think, right? You know, whether it's saying like, this is what I choose to do, or this is how, you know, this is what helped me look at some of these issues. You know, that's where I had to like pedal myself backwards and be like, gosh, did I misstep here? I did not want to try and make her wrong. And I realized too that part of when I left and I had my son with me too, I just like felt my own blood pressure, right? Like my internal like stress response was higher. And I think part of it because I was like, well, this doesn't feel like I don't want to make you wrong in your classroom. I don't want to also feel like I'm under attack by just giving my time to give like some of my, you know, story and the way I choose to look at patient care and things like that. And that topic is so sensitive to me, meaning birth and pregnancy and babies and maternal health, just because I see some of the aftershocks of when we don't let women know some of these decisions that are on the table. And there is a time and a place for some of these like more medical interventions. So hear me that I'm not saying that, but there's also so many layers to that decision making that are generally not well discussed. And and then, you know, we have women, especially new moms who have not been through the process of birth before, where it is truly like a deer in headlights experience at times without maybe the like maternal network around you to help navigate some of these choices and to go through the process that is transformative, but also can be really scary. And there's a lot coming at you. So, you know, I see that and also wanting the best for the baby, which I think we don't have to go through so far down the rabbit hole to just even have the conversation about like, well, what is best for the baby? Well, it's like most of the time it's going to be the natural route. Like babies are meant to nurse. Otherwise, why would we produce milk? Like it doesn't take too much critical thinking to think about some of these things of like, so I bring that up in the sense that, when we think about the history of birth and the culture around birth in our country, even things like in the 50s and 60s, I believe women that had, the ability to go to the hospital to have births were taught that like you need to go get formula. That's what your baby is going to do best on is formula, right? Like we have been indoctrinated in some ways to not trust what our systems provide, and this like very, very normal thing that is birth to like sustain our species, right? And yet like we look at, it's been happening for decades and decades that we've been disconnected from that process, so much so that a woman could be taught that like your breast milk isn't the best, actually go buy it from the store. And that's just like when you start to peel back those layers and realize like there is so much work to be done here to just open these conversations up to the next level to give women the power back in birth, the family the power back in birth, which leads to better health outcomes for everyone involved, right?
Yes, I totally agree with you. I'm just hearing this from a I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. It's not just introspective. I'm trying to see it from I was having this conversation this weekend. You asked about the weekend. I'm like, one of the things is I was doing a lot of like physical work around the house on some things that we just finally got a chance to catch up on, right? So I'm out doing yard work. I'm actually weeding some of the beds. I'm cleaning up some different things, trimming, blah, blah, blah. So I'm always like processing data. I'm either listening to something or I'm, if I'm active, I was literally thinking and processing something I had been already listening to and having a discussion about. And one of the things on that, Lona, was this the ability to see things from another perspective, right?
Mhm.
So you're coming at this with this experiential, clinical, very educated awareness, and not so educated that your educated intelligence is making all those decisions. Your innate intelligence and your intuition is still active. That's how I see you interact in the world, right? You hone into your own resources with educated intelligence supporting.
Right.
We come to this conflict with others in that model is if we broke it down into the attachment of reactionary behavior or clinical decision making, medical decision making based on fear or based on empowerment. So if I asked you, where are those decisions? Because I can have a bunch of lay people tell me why their industrialized medical birth process and formula was better than breast milk and a natural birth for all the reasons they would regurgitate
Mhm.
why it was done to them, why they were the victim of a circumstance that required that kind of medical intervention. Therefore, it's
Mhm.
all absolutely necessary versus someone on
Right.
the other side who, if there were two sides, there's probably many colors, but if there were
Mhm.
two sides, and now it's the body is self-healing. We do create our own breast milk. The baby does know how to latch immediately, which my niece just told me. He crawled right up and found it like just
Yes.
like that. I mean, how does the baby know, right? You have the same argument on the other side that says the baby's dumb. We got to do everything for him. That, all this requires a white coat or a nurse right there, or this doesn't happen naturally. And you should live in fear. What do you
Mhm.
say to that distortion from reality?
Yeah. I think a lot of it starts with listening, and that obviously was hard this morning in this conversation because I was the one that was in there as a speaker. So if I could have been one on one with her to understand her point of view, you know, I think when somebody comes from a scenario where a lot of catastrophic, and when I say catastrophic, like let's say the mom went into birth thinking she wanted to have it. And when I say went into birth, like her idea at 7 months was, I'm going to have a natural birth down the road here. Right. And I'm thinking of like an example in our office right now where it was a new mom, new dad. They don't have any birth experience as far as previous children being born. And they go in, and she is a smaller woman, and she was going past 40 weeks. And so then the fear starts to get intertwined into her mind that maybe maybe this baby's going to be too big for her, right? And so I'm just using an example that I can think of right now. And so I think it starts right there where we start to doubt whether we can birth our babies because of the knowledge we're given of things from like whether it's the ultrasounds or other people's birth experiences that starts to like sometimes way heavier than the knowledge we have because we already are self-doubting. And so it's almost like cultural, I think, at this point, that as women, we don't have a lot of great examples around us most of the time of women who are like, you can do it. Your body's going to do great. Like this has been how we, if we think back 100 years ago, everybody had their babies at home and it was pretty normal. And we've just come so far in a different way in this last 100 years. And again, I know there's a time and place where we've saved moms' lives and we've saved babies' lives because of what's available to us. But not every birth is a medical, emergency, right? And so in this example I'm thinking of in the office, well, they induce her, right? And then things aren't progressing as well as they should or as fast as quote unquote they should, even though she wasn't ready to go in labor already. And then there's a lot of trauma on this baby because she's getting stuck and not coming down because mom's not progressing. And then mom thinks her body's doing it wrong. And it just keeps going. And so there was a lot of intervention that ended up happening that eventually led to a C-section. And then this baby had a seizure. And then there was a lot of other things that I question, like, had we just let, and we will never know, had we just let mom go into the natural rhythm of whether that would have been at 41 weeks, 42 weeks, because the other thing is we most of the time we don't want to hear this, especially when we're in our third trimester, that like a normal range for babies being born is actually 37 to 43 weeks, right? Like, just like we all don't have the same shoe size, right? Why would we all birth right around 40 weeks? Like there's a wide array of what actually would be normal for the gestation period. And so I just offer this partly because I just don't hear enough people having this conversation, right? Of like that sharing our stories and recognizing too that like sometimes what happened in our first birth, we learned a lot from it, and that there are a lot of women out there that can help you maybe have the birth that you intended to have the first time around now that you know some different things. So maybe you don't want to intervene, or maybe you do, but now you're coming into it with a more educated perspective. But I find that a lot of times the new moms in our office, they don't get the same provider every time. They don't even know some of the questions to be asking, because how would you, right? Especially if they don't have, a mom or a grandma around them or a friend that's really, telling them some of the truth about like what their body's about to go through and what their life is about to transform like as you bring life in. That it is really an isolating time sometimes when you're left to make all these decisions and maybe the process doesn't go the way that you want. So I think the more we can have this conversation, I think the more that you can, sift through and know that this is going to be really important as a couple having children to like start to learn about birth and birth in our country and what's the outcomes with some of the choices there, and not be afraid to ask those questions. And if you don't, get an answer, like ask someone else, right? And we have that ability to be the squeaky wheels sometimes to just get more information. And sometimes that's what it's going to take to really start to like pull healthcare back into your hands. And that can be true even after you've had the baby already, So I was just down, my brother just had a baby this last weekend, and, there was a lot of things that happened. They had a hospital birth, but still baby and mom are doing great. But at one point I told my brother when he was calling me, asking some of these questions on the phone, I was like, don't be afraid to ask that. You don't have to be a jerk about it. Like just, when they're telling you have to do this next step, ask him, and what happens if we choose not to? What are our other options on the table? And I think that's where most people don't know that you can even ask some of these questions. Well, what if we don't want to do that? Could we do that later if we choose to do that? What happens if we leave the hospital? Can we come back? Like, can we ask these questions? Right? Mm-hmm. Well, I get that not everyone's going to have a home birth, but we can be empowered to like really start to share what we want, first of all, what our desires are, and then ask, with that in mind, why would we make some of these other decisions?
Well, I think that's a brilliant response with your brother, is just literally feel okay with asking the questions, because a lot of these scenarios, just like you discussed, that I found too with my patients, is they have a problem confronting
Mhm.
it, and it really isn't, they're automatically going to confrontation when it really isn't confrontation, it's just a question.
Right.
And there may be confrontation based on some of the emotional intensity of it. But
There we are again, right? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it seems like it's a terribly emotional time right now. That's true. We had some conversations, my wife and I again, where we fall into this little groove where we all of a sudden we're talking and reading back different things to each other about what's kind of fascinating us in terms of human behavior, and then how do we apply that to help people, because we see this problem right out in front of us, right? Which is the conditioned response, the pattern of behavior that falls into the conditioned response, and
Right.
then and all the information that goes with that. When to turn humanity means they have to critically think, but they're exhausted from the current struggles they have. They're fatigued. I mean, I'm not here trying to clarify all the problems as much as I'm saying we're up against, as healthcare providers, you're up against communicating with students in an environment where they can hear both sides of the story, not just one, and one that doesn't necessarily always feed into fear, that
Mhm.
feeds empowerment, which there are forces out there against empowerment.
Mhm.
So, I mean, to me, this is kind of fascinating from just your lead, like taking real experiences with your brother, the teacher this morning, um, the patient in your office. I mean, this is how do patients listening, people listening to this, realize that there is a divine spark, okay, and they're the ones that get to choose. So,
Mhm.
what would you change maybe now in hindsight? What would you have said differently in the classroom
I
today?
don't know. I don't know that I would have said anything different. I think my expectations might be different as far as like how it's going to be received. Because I don't feel like I understood where I would have even misstepped in how I said, because I was just sharing from like where my belief system's at this point, which isn't just, it's been established through not only my own personal experiences, but schooling, and as well as, a lot of learning after school and patient care at this point, right? So, you know, I can have grace for her that I must have stepped on a nerve, and that doesn't necessarily make her wrong or myself wrong. I think where I sometimes get flabbergasted is just like, can we not, especially in what I thought I was walking into, a room that was going to be open discussion about healthcare topics, like, can we not have an open discussion sometimes, right? Like, and I think that's what breeds to this like climate around like that somehow somebody has to be wrong if someone chooses something different. And I don't think that helps anyone, right? Like, there needs to be more bridges built. When we look at healthcare and what's happening in healthcare right now, which I do think we're in like unprecedented times as far as like what's happening in our Western medicine system. We've got so many parts of it that are kind of like a dumpster fire, whether we're talking about like how insurances are involved in all of it, like the lack of transparency and billing there, let alone like if you wanted more holistic care, can you even access that within that system? And one of the questions I had for the students, because I think their generation is starting to transform this on some level, is like, there appears to me to be like a trend, or like it's trendy to be doing some of these things that we would consider more like granola or organic, right? Like, how many people are posting pictures of their like sourdough bread making and like their gardens, and even the high schoolers, like if I was in high school talking about sourdough bread in 1998, like that would have never happened. That wasn't trendy at that point. We didn't talk about organic food. We were eating Pop-Tarts. So I think it's happening that there's this shift, which makes me also believe this generation already knows to question some of these things. That doesn't mean that they won't utilize them at times, or that there's not a subset of them that are not interested in this. But it is interesting to me that, when the consumer, the people coming in for healthcare, are wanting more organic choices, more natural options, and doing some homework anyways, even if it's through their TikTok feed or, some of these other places. I think this is how you transform what's happening in the like traditional healthcare system, which in our area, we're seeing a lot of rapid change because we had two of our most long-term established hospital systems implode totally up here. So even access is so critical right now that there's just not access points for people, that it necessitates that you will have to find more grassroots options. I hope more like community-led things, whether it is more of a traditional, like what you would have thought of an MD 150 years ago that was doing house calls or having their own small little practice. Like, to me, that's empowering, because that's when people really know each other. They feel safe enough to ask some of these questions, and there's more accountability. Because if I don't know who you are, and you don't really know who I am, then like, are we really accountable to each other? We're just cogs in the wheels essentially at that point. And that's what I believe a lot of times it's become.
Right. Yeah. Kind of disjointed, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So where do you see, there's definitely been a movement. It seems like so many more of our patients, I shouldn't say our patients, so many more people that I see and interact with are aware. Like, I did a recent interview with Dr. Pierre Corey, and what was so refreshing, this was also just a recent discussion yesterday I was having with my neighbor. The ability for people to take new information and pivot on that information, instead of being so attached to their previous story, they cannot take new information and enact or behave any differently because of that level of either comfort, magnitude of the conditioning, the belief set, and this belief set's on top of that one, which is on top of that one. So we definitely can't make that belief set wrong. We're saying maybe a number of the same thing in a number of different ways, but that conversation that you had about, and the level of emotion goes from 0 to high emotion in such a short period of time, makes it unable to exchange information. Now each side tends to defend their point. I don't know. And again, I'm not trying to impose on what you do differently, because like you'd said, maybe nothing, but other than, holy cow, how did I get here? And was there something that obviously offended that person by their response? And sometimes you did absolutely, I mean, 0 wrong, even going in with a considerate and attentive mindset around other people's varying perspectives, and you set something off that you don't know. It's like, that's their issue. We know that, not yours. But the sad thing is, you want your message to be heard, and you feel like now it's not.
Right.
Maybe, right?
Yeah. And it just, it made me rethink, like, is this time that I want to devote going into the schools? Because it just felt, like I don't really feel like going to be under attack on a Tuesday morning. But I also think you hit the nail on the head there, Wade, with like, I do think there are, and maybe that was part of why it felt disjarring this morning, is I think all of us that are sitting here having conversations like this have only gotten here because we've been willing to like question a lot of things, right? Like, it's not like you or I necessarily were birthed into a culture that, oh, I already knew that to question some of these things, or I'm going to do my healthcare differently, or I'm, going to be open-minded this. And one of the things I, said to the students this morning is like, if you would have told me about how I chose to make some of my decisions now when I was in high school, I would have thought I sounded crazy, like that sounds crazy. And, it was just through the process of learning and unlearning, and experiencing and watching that, you just keep baby stepping and sometimes diving into different areas of this. And, since 2020, I think, you can take that idea of like going down, quote unquote, the rabbit hole on healthcare decisions and start applying it to like so many other decisions, like, well, how I look at finance and financial, or how we look at the government, or how we look at, should we be in public school or homeschooling or private school? Like I feel like it begs, like when you start questioning one aspect that's a foundational part of modern day culture, it isn't so hard to see where all of a sudden we start to go, oh, now I'm starting to question this other thing. And now I'm starting to look in deeper into that. And I get that not everyone wants to do that. And maybe wouldn't come up with the same ideas off of what they're looking at either. But I also think there's a lot of people who are, like you said, like they're starting to question, and they are sifting through information and able to pivot and not have it mean that everything they chose previously made it wrong. Like for me, vaccination, the first that I really started to consider it was right before I actually received my last vaccine. I was on the fence about getting it. I was 20 years old and I got it and had a seizure. And so it was pretty easy for me to like not get them after that point, because I already was starting to question it, got pressured by my mother and the doctor to get the vaccine, and did it, and promptly woke up on the floor with blood in my mouth because I landed on my face and no one caught me on the doctor's table. And so for me personally, that was an easy decision. Like, I'm just not getting those anymore. And I hadn't done any homework up until that point. I had just had this feeling like maybe I don't want to get this anymore. And then after that is when I started to like learn a lot more and listen to speakers that had done way more research than me and pointed me in various directions to start to learn and unlearn. And same was true with birth. I had a feeling that I didn't want certain things to happen. But then as I found myself pregnant, I already had some knowledge from going through like ICPA seminar information, the International Pediatric Chiropractic Association information. But my midwife started really pointing me in directions. And part of what she also did for me was say, when I'd ask her questions, she actually said things like, well, how do you feel about that? Like, how does that sit with you? Where it was part of getting the people back in to realize like there is a lot of answers that can come from within, that also, yes, educate yourself, but also don't downplay the like natural instincts so many of these decisions can come from, if we would get back in touch with that. Right. And so we tend to put so much emphasis on the education and the research and all that. But there is so much power in the realization that like, just like two cells eventually become 4 cells, become 16 cells, become 32, like that didn't require any education, right? There's this innate inborn process that's always trying to like take your life and your information that's coming through you and do what it can to adapt and heal and thrive. And yes, sometimes there's various reasons why that maybe isn't what your experience is in this moment, but that power hasn't left you, certainly not in birth either. And so it's like, well, some level we trust it to form the baby in our belly, but the second that baby comes out, like we're like, oh, we know better, and like that, the more I started thinking about it, I'm like, that's asinine, like somehow it has gotten me to this point where I'm ready to like be a portal for life, right? Like and then, like I started to really think about, what do we do to babies the second they're pulled from mom? Like there's a lot of choices that are quote unquote choices that were never really even like discussed up until recent years, where now I think it is discussed more further, like more commonly anyways. But just made me realize like, yeah, so much of it has been on some level indoctrination that this is just what you do. And for my midwife, one of the things she said to me when I was at one of my first appointments with her, she's like, what are you going to do if you have a little boy? That's what she said to me. And I was like, what do you mean? I hadn't thought about it. You talk about like getting new information and sifting through, right? And I said, what do you mean? And she's like, I'm going to just say a few words to you and get your reaction. And I was like, all right. And she said, female genital cutting. And I said, oh, right. And she's like, well, what do you think we're doing to the little boys in this country? And I was like, say less. Like for me, that's all she had to say. I made the like connection in my mind. I was like, I'm out. But my husband was not so easily swayed. Like he did not have the same, like, he was just like, oh, well, we're doing it, And I just realized it felt so wrong to me that I was willing to just like plant myself on the 50% of that decision and be unswayed. And so I figured something will happen. He'll change his mind, or I don't know. And so for about 6 months, we were like stalemated and we didn't know if we were having a boy. And he went maybe like 3 weeks before our oldest was born. He went on a camping trip. And I wasn't actually real pleased that he left at the time because I'm thinking I could have a baby anytime now. But when he came back, he's like, so I met so and so there, this family that he had grown up with. And he's like, they decided to not circumcise any of their sons. And I guess it's like less commonly done than it was before. And sometimes insurance isn't even paying for it. And it was like when he heard someone other than me kind of talk him through this stuff, then all of a sudden it was like, it's okay. Right. And I just took that as like, all right, that was what I was waiting for. And then we had Jack. So, yes, information as to why you're choosing things, but also just information that it's okay to slow down on the process of making some of these decisions. And sometimes people just need to have conversations around them. Like, why would I make this decision? Why wouldn't I make this decision? What does it mean if we make this decision? Can we make this decision later? Like it doesn't have to be so final sometimes. Um,
Right. And I think, back to that, that applies directly to the next piece as that little son of yours is growing up, which is stages of vaccines and why they're admitted when they are and why they
mhm.
pressure the time span when to us it seems pressure and we see the big picture of it. There was a lot of rehashing this weekend. Another part of that conversation is Dr. Heather's like, you know, after reading this book, she's like, all this stuff, they're finally catching on. I see it more and more in these areas. And this, because she's reading multiple authors and multiple different pieces, and they kind of circle back around. She's like, we've been talking about vaccines for 30 years, literally. This is my 30th year. And we were discussing in our extended library,
Mhm.
we had, I don't know, we had 50 plus books uh, on vaccine, probably a loan that we would loan out, and that just shrunk over time because parents would keep them. And, there was a lot of awesome, check it out, bring it back, check it out, bring it back. And then there was some like the library just shrunk over years, right? And it was never the point, and I've said this in many different venues, it was never the point where we were making those decisions for parents and shooting on them as much as we were giving them another part of that equation that they never hear. Well, of
Right.
course, that sounds weird at first. And some of them intuitively, and you know this to be true, I'm guessing, is they already know it to be true. They just needed some outside support, like maybe your husband,
Yes.
um, who didn't really think of that because that's just what we do. Never
Mhm.
really had to think about it till now, but now we'd be doing something different. Who else knows about this? Oh, so and so does. Okay, then it's okay.
Yeah.
But
My wife's not so crazy. Yeah.
yeah, my wife's not so crazy in those ways. But like even with Dr. Corey, one of the most brilliant things, and I've shared this with him, what I revere is the willingness to be so invested in his profession, to be such a high level influencer at his profession, where he was in his career, hours, dollars,
Mm.
um, what he was publishing, who he was teaching around the world with his ultrasound techniques he developed, to then experience COVID, see the holes in what they were allowing him to treat with what they weren't, discover that his daughter's history, neurological response from, which he's documented of pandas, had a vaccine reaction, to then fast forward, see what's going on, interpret and investigate his own life, his own workings, and
Mhm.
not only pivot from that, but actually lay down new tracks in a completely different direction and go the road of most difficult, but is the right thing to do. So he will tell you he couldn't help it. It just is the natural thing. And yet, how many of his colleagues and our colleagues, whoever it may be, in professions get so invested they're unwilling to change and they got to do what they got to do to feed their families, so they make those choices. Um, I heard another, again, there's how many examples of people that had to keep their job in 2020, therefore in 2021 and got vaccinated. And
Mhm.
yet to date, they're struggling with many different things, or they're gone because they had a super cancer and died. And you can't put your finger on what it is, but yet we know scientists around the world are claiming there is direct relationship with that. So I just find it fascinating that we're having this conversation about little bitty things when we're trying to help people see a different perspective that turn out to be big things in healthcare. And
Right.
the road with which it takes to be able to communicate this message or share information in an open, loving way that allows people to then make choices that better suit them, whatever that is. Because if it's a C-section because they're living in fear, do what you got to do. That is so cool. I'm going to
Well, and
support you.
wait, when you're connected to your body in a way where you're like, I know that, my body has this power. You may also, I have a girlfriend who she has twins and she delivered one vaginally and she's like, I just knew like something was off, right? And like when they were starting to have trouble, she like said to the team in the hospital, like she's like, something's not right. And they ended up taking the second twin cesarean, right? It's like to me, that's still a very empowered birth because you were like in this place of like, I'm also in my body enough to like know that I have choices here, right? Like, so I think that some of it is just fundamentally like, have we put people in the position to be driver's seat and will they be willing to take it? And that doesn't mean you have to know everything. It just means that you're like actively involved in like your life, your process, your health, right? That to me is like a lot of what it boils down to is like this willingness to assume responsibility, radical responsibility, right? And then walk that out in whatever choices like you decide to go with, not because anyone else places judgment on you for making them. Like, no, I know this was the right choice for me to make, and then move with that, right? Versus the regret of not, you know, feeling connected to your own choice.
That's brilliant. That's perfectly put.
Thanks.
Um, what do you, with that said, I mean, you summarized a bunch of things there for moms that don't know and what to do and how to do it. It's like gather information, make the choice for you. If it's your choice, and you said the magic words, actively participating.
Mhm. I think we need community so badly. Like, I think we need our people, when they say like we hear things like it takes a village, right? Like it really does take a village. And the village may look different in what part of the like aspect of real life we're talking about. So in birthing, you have a certain village around you that and I feel like that's part of many times what's lacking is who do I go to? I was with my sister-in-law who had, a pretty crazy clotting situation happen. And I was so glad I was down there to just like walk them through that 24 hours where it would have been easy to like go like, oh my gosh, what's happening? I've never been here before. If I don't have anyone that's walked through this before, it's really scary, right? And that's where community is so important in whatever we're walking through. So I think part of it for moms or dads or anyone is to recognize, do I have the community I need to like live the life that I want to live and have the health I want to live? And yeah, you might have to spend money to go find those people, right? Like whether that's in your office, Wade, or our office or somewhere else, we're happy to help you find providers that are hopefully very heart-centered providers, but also not afraid to like give you some thoughts on things. And you need to be able to have that dialogue. Now, that doesn't mean that you always have to agree with everything either. It should be that you can have dialogue. So I think that's part of it is establishing like, do I have the right people on my team? And you're going to want to ask the questions to people who can actually walk you to the place you're trying to go. So I'm not going to ask my dentist for advice on birthing, generally speaking, like that's not the right person. Just like I might not ask my dad for chiropractic business advice, right? Like it's not the same. They may be a community member in parts of my life, but I have to recognize also who am I going for support maybe isn't the person who can offer me the like support to get me where I'm trying to go. So I think that's a really crucial piece that I do think we have to reestablish, especially as women and especially in a birthing community, is like, who is my community? And even if I'm having if I'm choosing to have hospital birth, could I have a doula come in with me, especially if it's my first time and I know that doula is going to be in the room and she knows my birth plan and my husband's there and my husband's it's his first time. So the doula is like kind of like our guardian then, if that makes sense. So I think that those type of relationships become really, really critical.
Well said. Do you have a community that I mean, you have your local community. How do you, and I've seen how well you refer your patients, either friends or families, to other locations looking for a doc in our small network
Mhm.
of docs we communicate with regularly. Um, but
Yeah.
you're connected in the profession, and then you have some connections outside. So you've been willing to go uh, pretty deep to get people under good care and
Right.
in a good community.
Yeah, I think for myself, I see the gap in, especially, I think about what I had from my midwife. My midwife was a home birth midwife and she came, both, I was meeting with her before the baby came and then after the baby came, and some of the questions and the ways that she just had confidence that I did not have yet, like, your baby's wired to do this. You will figure out nursing. Yes, it's hard. Yes, this is like not a fun time right now. Yeah, like that, just her confidence then was like, okay, I got this. I can do this. And if I wouldn't have had that, I can see where, it could have easily gone sideways. And I felt like I got hit by a truck. So to have someone that could like nurture you and also be firm with you was really, really critical. But I think that's true in anything. I'm using the example of birthing a baby at this point, but I think it's true in like whatever we're bringing forth in the world. A lot of times having people that are trusted mentors walk us through some of these things obviously leads to generally less heartache or challenge. So, you know, I don't know that I've had to build my community, right? Let's put it that way. Like, and I think we all have to, and that's part of like almost like the becoming, right? Is like you've got to find your people and then you get to step into like being part of a community that really is the group of people you want. And if the community doesn't exist, build it, right? Like that's part of it too, is like I think that's part of what we're in right now is, as some of these traditional ways that we've, whether we're talking about healthcare or even public education or whatever, as some of these things are fracturing or having, problems that we all agree on, we don't know the solution there. I think the beauty is there's more of this, like, I'm going to go back to saying the word grassroots, but there's other things growing up around these things. Like in our area, we're in a small area. There's already been 3 new schools started since 2020, right? Like I look at that, like we haven't had schools like that started, at least 3 schools in this area. Um, and that's happening because people want new choices, new community, right? So I think this is a time for that. You don't see what you need, you got to build it, right?
So is this a time to hold steadfast to principles that empower people, or is this a time to bail and trust the government on everything?
um, yeah, I think it's time to get rooted with people first that, if you don't feel steadfast, find your people that feel empowering to you and that you resonate with and maybe you feel energized by, and then ask them the questions of like, how did you get your conviction or where did you learn some of these things, or like help leave breadcrumbs for the people that are coming, from where you just were, right? That's what I find is like, I don't know exactly what's up ahead, but I know some things I just walked through and I can leave breadcrumbs for other people. That's how that community gets built too. So yeah, I think it's a time to get rooted in who you are and, life purpose. And I think a lot of health is actually how much like vital force is moving through you. And that comes from like putting your energy towards something that you love to work on and be part of and nurture. So I think it all is related. But we have been sold health in one format, as well as many times sold what our life should look like. And I think that's part of what is getting broken up is that, we all have callings and things that light us up and we should be doing those things. And that would also lead to better health for us. So I think it's a time to root back into yourself.
I don't know if that was the mic drop or maybe that was the most adequate parting words on what you'd recommend for people's grounding, finding community, right? What I really wanted to find out, based on everything you kind of described earlier, was, and you kind of just summarized it in a bit. Like, you showed some vulnerability in not knowing your answers, like the first birth to the second birth, right? And then the confidence now, and just like starting your practice and then where you're at now, and the confidence you have to lead and open new offices and whatnot, right? Train new staff, train new docs. Where is this, like, your area growing? I'm kind of trying to formulate the question, but it has to do with your expertise and your focus right now, like your book, number one. That's a way you've extended thoughts and shared and were vulnerable and wanted to share your story. What do you recommend for these young parents who are in these last 4 years of experience,
Mhm.
either not getting pregnant? I've seen a boom in babies just recently, which is kind of bizarre, right? Would you
Mhm.
agree?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think about that. Sometimes I go in waves where I'm like, gosh, a lot of people are pregnant, but then I'm like, do I just feel that way because I'm touching more pregnant mamas? I don't know, I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't
it's bizarre. I'm trying to put a beat on it too. Is it because we just saw a wave of it and it's not really the case? Because I know there's a lot of
know.
infertility as well as a result of some things that happened. So, um, I just think maybe you've already summarized some of it, but if there were the the encouraging words, like how does one go about maybe finding that community or finding their healthcare provider, right? Like, it's such a relationship that's undervalued in the system right now, that that's the beginning of, I think, the trust that's been lost.
Mhm. It's
So
true.
your words.
I would just say, like, if you already have, like, let's even say it's a dentist that you really resonate with, or a veterinarian or a chiropractor or whatever, like the people who are already established in your community that you already established trust with, that's who I would ask for the recommendations of where they go for certain things, or who do they really love. Because likely if you resonate with them, in a certain way, you will probably get a better referral that you resonate with if you already go to people that you have trust built with to build that network. And if not, just know that you're like shopping around on some level. Like if you are established somewhere, and I've had so many people sometimes say like, well, I got a new doctor, but I don't, I'm not going to ask them that question, or I don't know. They had really interesting bedside manner, but I still have to go to them because they're my rheumatoid doctor, right? Or something like that. It's like, but do you? Like, is that your only option? Or what other options are there, right? So, yes, it may not always be convenient. And sometimes I understand that maybe there is only one doctor, right? But especially now that there's so many things that can even be done virtually, you can find second opinions in other ways. And I think that's putting, Wade, you said it first, I believe, or I remember us talking in the last couple of years where it was like the doctor of the future is the patient, right? And, you know, that may sound scary, but I think it's empowering. And that means that like you're the captain of your ship and you live in your body, and you're going to have to find the people that are going to row the boat with you, but don't put them in the captain's seat. Right. So
Right.
that's where I think it is like within your community, find the people you trust. Maybe it's even just, other moms in a mom's group with you, and that maybe have similar values to you. Like, where do they go? Who do they use? Do they drive 45 minutes because there's someone better in the community, a little further away, right? Don't be afraid to like do that. Um,
Right.
mhm.
Well, and you said something or two about value, right? People, I encourage patients to value them. Like, I'm not selling them anything. I'm selling them on themselves, that they're worth taking care of, right?
Amen.
So, um, we had the amazing Dr. Lona Cook here today. You want to tell people where they can find you and your book?
Yeah, probably the easiest way to find me is on like Instagram or Facebook, Lona Cook. And then my book that I wrote for anyone, probably mostly women, but is on Amazon, and it's called Reclamation, the Evolution of a Hot Mess. And I walk through sort of like my process of waking up to like having a lot more choice and power in how I perceived my life and myself and like how I was going to navigate making better decisions. So that's there for you if you'd like it. Thanks,
Yes,
Wade.
and by the way, it's not just for women. I read it, and Lona
Thank
does a great job in that book. So I think it's a great read, and she's wonderfully transparent, and I would
you.
say wonderfully vulnerable to the point where I think that's such an endearing quality when you're trying to communicate that people, can naturally trust you. And so anyway, I just know uh, the impact you've had in Wisconsin is awesome.
Thank you.
And watching you grow over the years has been fantastic. So you got bigger things ahead of you as well. And maybe the next time we talk, we can talk more about the research project that you got going and that is now starting to get some traction for recording.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks again.
Okay. See you, friend.
See you later.